Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. I recently did a video about Queen Mary and her love of collecting, so it got me wondering what more about Queen Mary that we could find out. So I'm not going to do quite a biography of Queen Mary, more like how she was as a person, and later I'll probably do videos about her and her parents and marriage and how she interacted with her sons. But the first window of Queen Mary's personality comes from the web article commonreader.substack.com. And these are fascinating traits that she had. She remembered the handwriting of a woman from Australia who had written to her 15 years earlier. She had phenomenal power of memory recall, and that's quite remarkable. She could hear what everyone was saying at a table of 30 people. She never misused her ability, but she knew exactly what was going on. She was a collector and a curator, making all her own labels and creating a family museum in Frogmore. Her catalog system was first rate. Everything was labeled. It was said she could have been a curator. She had an unrivaled and entirely accurate knowledge of all members of her extensive royal relations across Europe. Everyone comments on her incredibly detailed knowledge, always immediately accessible to her. And she had a lifelong interest in royal history, especially of objects lost over time. She was a highly completist and chased down hundreds of items over the years, and she had such an encyclopedic knowledge that she could identify mislabelings of royal ancestors and antique shops she visited. In the same article, it was mentioned that Queen Mary would have a lady-in-waiting read to her for 7 hours, and I would have had laryngitis over that. Not only did she like being read to, she liked to read. Queen Mary was read extensively in history and literature, and she picked up Dostoevsky as an old lady. And there was a family story that all the time spent waiting for her mother, she read a 3-volume history of the Dutch Republic. So she's quite impressive. And Queen Mary, she didn't like being late. She said, "Why should anybody be late? I know exactly how long it takes me to dress." Then we all know, but she had that love of collecting. Queen Mary said she got her love of collecting from her father, but it seems her mother liked to spend too. The problem was her parents didn't have wealth. In 1883, the Techs had to take their young family and escape the continent, fleeing from debtors to try to live cheaply among kind-hearted relatives. So Queen Mary didn't start out with the best of things happening in her life. Then next it was said that she was a social reject. So although she entered the world in 1867 at the same room as her cousin Queen Victoria, Mary's bloodlines were decidedly on the shady side of the royal family. Her parents, Frances of Teck and Princess Mary, were younger or less legitimate children, and the house of Teck had been long in disrepair. Mary's parents wanted her to get married, but as a royal, Mary wasn't exactly allowed to marry a member of the regular aristocracy, and yet none of the true nobles wanted anything to do with her either. According to Factinate.com, the British upper crust was none too pleased with her looks. They deemed her very German-looking, the height of an insult at the time, as well as frumpish. So Queen Victoria sets up her grandson. Queen Victoria wanted to find her grandson Albert, who was in line to be a king, a person to marry. The only thing was that Albert wasn't that great a catch. He was described as amiable, but indecisive, as well as densely stupid. So Queen Victoria had tried setting him up with numerous princesses, but none of them wanted to marry him. And not only because he might have been simple, but there were rumors swirling around about him that he fathered a secret love child, that he'd been involved in a scandal with night walkers, and even that he was Jack the Ripper. So Mary didn't care about all that. She wanted to be married. But then tragedy struck. 6 weeks before the wedding, Albert died from influenza. And the tragedy in all this is, in his final words, Albert wasn't thinking about his fiancée Mary. He asked his assistants to bring him his ex-lover to his bed so he could say goodbye to the person he really cared about. So that probably hurt if she found out about that. So next, Mary becomes close to Albert's brother, George. Queen Victoria started to steer Mary to George. Months before, George was in negotiations to marry Princess Marie of Edinburgh, only to have the girl reject him. The snub destroyed his self-confidence, and his interest in Mary sounded like a rebound. Well, they both felt weird about wedding each other after his brother's death, but decided to do it for a sense of duty to the nation. So that's not really the most romantic reason to get married. So the second time he proposed, Mary accepted. And the funny thing was that love grew between them, according to Factinate.com. The morning of their big day, both Mary and George were busy getting ready when the groom accidentally caught sight of his bride-to-be down one of Buckingham Palace's long hallways. His response was truly romantic. The prince gave a low and courtly bow to Mary, a gesture that touched the girl to the core. It was the beginning of something no one expected. And a few months after their marriage, they were truly in love, and George never had a mistress. And they had 6 kids together. And some things I read said she wasn't a very good mother, but in another article I read, she, unlike her husband, used to have fun with her kids and did normal kid activities with them. In World War I, Mary insisted the palace go on rations like everybody else had to do in England, and she would go to the hospitals to visit the soldiers, but it took a mental toll on her. According to HistoryExtra.com, she was utterly tireless in her efforts to raise money and support troops, so much so that at one point in 1917 she suffered a collapse and was diagnosed with exhaustion. Despite being ordered to cut back on her duties, she carried on. Throughout his reign, George never got tired of telling her or anyone else in earshot he would be lost without his wife's guidance, her unwavering support, and her commitment to their roles as king and queen. During these years, Tsar Nicholas II and the rest of the Russian Imperial Romanov family begged for asylum with King George and Queen Mary, and this wasn't a random plea because George and Nicholas were cousins and they looked alike to boot. And then, despite this, Mary and her husband refused them flat, and they would live to regret it. Months later, the Romanovs were killed during the Russian Revolution. Mary's husband felt guilt about it and really started smoking heavily, leading to numerous medical conditions that eventually took his life. According to the House of Windsor.weebly.com, George became increasingly frail after the war years, and Mary was seen with her husband more and more. And George and Mary began to scale their duties down and relax, with Mary fond of tennis at Wimbledon. And in 1935, George and Mary celebrated their silver jubilee. George and Mary had become figures that saved the British monarchy and figures that were a symbol of hope for the public. But on 20th of January 1936, George V died of pleurisy. Before that, Mary had taken charge and was a loving wife who stayed by his side whenever she could, making sure he got enough rest. And Mary was so instrumental when someone asked one of the royal doctors who had pulled George back to life, the medic replied, "The Queen." She did the best she could, but in 1936, George died in his bed from all his ailments. And the Queen, who was very religious, probably wasn't pleased that the king's doctor ended his life with a lethal injection of morphine. And when George passed away, January 1936, Queen Mary wrote that her heart was broken, for they had been married for more than 40 years. Now Mary gets obsessed. She got obsessed about collecting royal jewels, and one time Mary paid 3 times the market value for a collection of emeralds. Near the end of her life, she wanted to get all the royal memorabilia back. She would often go through royal inventories, mark down what had been borrowed but not returned, and then immediately write to the holders and demand the pieces back. And then when she was over at someone's estate and she saw something she liked, the queen consort would loudly proclaim how much she admired the piece. It was all in hopes that her host would feel obligated to politely donate the item to the queen. And Mary was smart till the end. Mary supported her second son, Albert, as he became King George VI after Edward stepped down from the crown, and she kept a watchful eye over her grandchildren, the future Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, and insisted on giving them a well-rounded education in defiance of her more traditional parents' wishes. And Mary had insisted that the coronation go on. When it came time near the time of Elizabeth II's coronation, Queen Mary insisted that if she died, that the coronation continue. So she passed away weeks before the coronation at the age of 85, and the coronation continued on as scheduled. Well, she loved India. The future King George and Queen Mary had visited there in 1905 and 1906, and she had an intellectual curiosity. Before the trip, she began studying, and she read 36 books about serious works of history and politics, and she also studied their ethnic, religious, and cultural richness. She wanted to learn about the real people of India and their religions. On the night before she died at Marlborough House in 1953, Queen Mary had a book on India read aloud to her. Queen Mary said, "When I die, India would be found written in my heart." So Queen Mary created her own destiny into the royal family, determined to be queen. She found unexpected love when she married George, and they loved one another. George told people numerous times he never would have been able to do his job without her support and guidance. And she felt it was her duty to gather up royal memorabilia and did a great job at getting items back to the palace. And she also got new items that became part of the royal collection. She was a complex person who some thought us cold and others thought she was loving. She did a lot to support the English people by supporting the soldiers during World War I and World War II, and she was a lover of books and read a lot of them. She made sure her granddaughters were getting more education than what they were going to get, and she had a sense of duty to the country that Queen Elizabeth II carried on, and I'm sure that Queen Mary would have been proud to see her values carried on in Queen Elizabeth. So I hope that you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.